Alrighty, this should be working. Welcome to my presentation on miracles for ST501 Prolegomena. I'm going to be doing an analysis of miracles evidentially and then theologically in a way that I haven't seen done by too many scholars or theologians. I think this could be a helpful way to see not only that miracles happen, but also, given the fact that they happen, which metaphysical model of God best explains and allows for miracles. So, with that quick statement, let's go on to this presentation. There we go. So, what is a miracle? And how can we identify a healing miracle? The reason I'm using healing miracles is because that is one of the most commonly begged for and requested ones from atheists. And so I think that might be one of the best examples to focus on for this whole presentation. But number one, what is a miracle? Well, as a Thomist, I love what Saint Thomas Aquinas states about miracles, which is those events that are properly to be styled miracles, which happen by divine power beyond the order commonly observed in nature. So, Summa Contra Gentiles, this is really simple, direct, and clear. Norman Geisler echoes this in his writing as well, although perhaps he has it a bit more broad, so this one's more specific. Anything that happens by divine power beyond the order commonly observed in nature. And we also identify healings via the Lambertini criteria. So, in order to make sure that people understand that this is not just a random remission miracle, right? Where, oh, someone's going to get sick and then all of a sudden they don't get sick, or someone has a condition that could improve and maybe the reason they healed was because of some sort of natural cause we don't know yet. What I want to focus on for this presentation is an example of a real miracle that follows the following guidelines. So, according to Lambertini's criteria from the 1700s, a modern healing miracle can best be identified as one that is serious and impossible to be cured by any human means and methods, right? Super important. Number two, this disease must not be in a stage where it can easily just disappear, right? Oh, you're in the first stage, but then because of your immune system, your body kicked it out. No, we need something that is real, and we need something that is serious and not going to just disappear. Number three, either no medical treatment must have been given that causes the cure, and we'll be reviewing a miracle today that has no cure, so there's no medical treatment that could have caused it. Number four, the cure has to be instantaneous. From that, we also find that it must be complete and it must be permanent. So that means that we have an instantaneous cure, which means it is an instant of miraculous divine intervention in which there's a full healing of the body of the specific disease or sickness that's being focused on, and it's permanent. It's not something that comes back a few days later. Otherwise, we could assume it's maybe psychosomatic. And then finally, the cure must not be preceded by some sort of medical or psychological event that induces a change. And again, we'll look at something without a cure so that that can't be posited as a possibility. So, our modern miracle we will be looking at is Barbara Kamuski Snyder. I hope I said that middle name correctly. Barbara was diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, at the age of about 16, all the way to the age of 31. She had severe progression of the condition most of the time in the hospital. Over those 15-ish, 16-ish years, she spent most of her time in the hospital under the care of a great number of doctors. One, Dr. Harold Adolph, and another, Dr. Thomas Marshall, had hopeless feelings about her condition and hopeless conclusions about her condition. Her condition was so well medically documented and so severe that everyone had assumed that she was as good as dead by the end of it. She had such severe multiple sclerosis that her hands were caved in towards her palms. Her feet were also curled in so that she couldn't put on slippers. She had, towards the end of her condition, around age 30, 31, permanent fetal positioning, right? And so she couldn't move from that because of the severity of her multiple sclerosis. She also had one collapsed lung and couldn't breathe on her own, so she needed a tracheostomy tube just to allow her to continue to breathe. She needed an ileostomy bag for her bowels, along with a catheter for urination, and she had become blind as a result of the multiple sclerosis as well. She was legally blind. So, with all of that said, I hope it can be understood very clearly that this was a very obvious case in which someone fit all the examples of what we talked about before. The MS is, number one, it's totally impossible to heal by human means. There's no cure. Number two, it was uniquely bad, and the progression was very severe, late stage MS at an early age with, again, permanent fetal positioning. Number three, there's no treatment for MS, so nothing could have been given that would have caused this cure that we'll talk about. Number four, the healing she experienced at the age of 31 when she was in her hospital room with her two friends from church, over there in the corner, reading letter after letter from people at her church on Pentecost Sunday, 1981, Pentecost Sunday, reading letter after letter of people who were praying for her. She was there with her friends. The doctors had applied her for hospice because they didn't think she had more than 6 months left to live. And then her healing was instantaneous. Incredible. She hears a voice from God that says, "My child, get up and walk." And she tells her friends about it while they're reading the letters. They run out to get her family, but before the family even comes back, she jumps out of her bed. Her hands are outstretched flat and straight. Her feet are outstretched flat so that she has her feet flat against the ground. She's also able to notice her hands and her feet are uncurled, right? They're normal, which means she was able to see that her blindness was healed. And also, she was able to breathe on her own. She took out her own tracheostomy tube. She was able to breathe on her own and move about on her own, despite what you would have expected, some muscular atrophy after all those years of being in the hospital. No, she had strong legs and was able to move about. That was a medical miracle. That was instantaneous, complete, very much so complete, and permanent. She did not have a remission of her MS at all, even until her death in, I believe, 2021. And there was no crisis or any type of treatment that could have caused this. This was a miracle. Her doctors even gave her a release form that explained that she had a sudden healing instance after 16-ish years at the hospital. And so this is a medically documented miracle. So what can we make of it? All right, the atheist says, okay, there's no naturalistic explanation for this, and there cannot be, because it's a condition without a cure, and there's no medical explanation, nothing done by the doctors that could have explained it, nothing done by her body that could have explained this. So even if it's a miracle, so what? What if at least one supernatural miracle happened? Well, this "so what" is actually a pretty big what. For instance, there are some worldviews we can automatically get rid of because they cannot account for the miraculous. Number one, atheism with naturalism, right? This is not a God of the gaps type of explanation. Oh, we don't know how it happened yet. No, it's very clear that there was no naturalistic way for this to happen, right? So this was supernatural. So naturalism, materialism, atheism out the window, out the door. Buddhism and Hinduism. I put stars next to this because technically you could say that there's some forms that allow for miracles, but most forms of Buddhism and Hinduism find that suffering is a means towards enlightenment, and therefore they consider, in many cases, miracles to be kind of cheap ways out of your karmic cycle or out of your enlightenment because it gives you power, which attaches you more to the world instead of less to it. Then deism, right out the window, it says miracles can happen. Pantheism and panentheism. This one takes a little bit of an explanation, but she was healed, but other people were not, despite other people praying for healing and her family praying for healing. She was healed, other people were not. If everyone who prayed the way that her family did prayed for healing, and everyone who prayed got healing, then I would argue that there's some reasonable expectation for evidence for pantheism or panentheism. If all is God or all is in God, then we can expect that everyone doing the same thing would lead to the same supernatural outcome. But that's not what happens. It's actually an impressive theistic evidence that not everyone who prays for healing is healed. Kind of interesting, right? Now, the worldviews which could account for the miraculous. We have theism more broadly, right? Christian, modern Judaism, and Islam. And I'll put those in a very general term, but at least on the outset, those could explain the miraculous. And then we have something like polytheism. So Hinduism, Mormonism, any type of general pantheon. These have a very low likelihood of explanatory power, though, because in their case, the fact that some people pray and get miracles, other people pray and don't, seems to work against polytheism. Because if there's one God of healing and one God of this specific disease, if this God is fighting against the other God and wins and allows for the healing of this individual, you would expect this God to just always be stronger than this God right here in every single case, right? Because they're gods, they're kind of locked in at their power. So, why is it that somebody who's praying for healing wouldn't get healed, even if they're praying the exact same way somebody else is? Well, with polytheism, we have an issue because their power scaling means that everyone who prays in this way for healing should get it, but not everyone does. Therefore, polytheism has an extremely low likelihood of being true, if not no possibility, because of the inconsistency of miraculous development. But theism has a high likelihood, very high likelihood. So, with all that being said, we can then move on to theistic explanations. We'll focus on theism because that has a much higher likelihood of explaining miracles or allowing for miracles to happen in the way that we observed previously with the healing of our wonderful MS patient. That's incredible. So, of the theistic explanations, which has the most number of meaningful modern miracles? So, this is more evidential, less of a theological analysis. When I say meaningful, I'm specifically saying miracles that are so powerful and robust and impressive that it leads to other people believing in God in a powerful movement. On a purely evidential case, Christian theism is, and this is like by a long shot, it has far more and far more meaningful, far more effective modern miracle cases. Uh, Cases that affect more people's lives, that cause more people to turn to Christianity. In Craig S. Keener's book, Miracles Today, he actually explains from a great number of works from other people that around 70%, this is Craig Keener citing J.P. Moreland, about 70% of the rapid evangelical growth in the past few decades across the world has been due to signs. And by that, we're obviously referring to miraculous signs, miracles. Then, if we go on from, again, that's J.P. Moreland's book that Craig S. Keener refers to, and Craig S. Keener's book is so impressive. I really, really do recommend it. It's really helpful. A lot of information about modern miracles. But we also have Claudia Oblau's God Can Heal Us Through and Through. This is impressive. So, Claudia explains that one state-approved church in China reported around half of all Christian conversions over a period of about 2 decades in the late 20th century, last century, were due to faith healing experiences. Now, some smaller local churches actually bumped that up, not from half of all Christian conversions, they bumped it up to around 90%, at least on the local levels for many of these churches. That's intriguing. You do not see large scale numbers of conversions into other religions, Mormonism, or Hinduism, or Islam, or modern day Judaism. You just don't see this kind of miracle and people responding to the miracle, these huge movements in other religions modern day. In Christianity, you still do. That's evidentially significant. But of the theistic explanations, this is a bit more theological, maybe metaphysical. Which model for God best explains or even allows for miracles? Simple monotheism of Islam, the simple monotheism of modern Judaism, or the Trinitarian monotheism of Christianity? Well, just to start where we agree, these three groups would all agree that God is immutable, transcendent, and eternal, timeless in some sense. That's really important, though, right? If we're going to say that some model of God allows God to, or explains how miracles can happen, and God interacts with his creation to cause miracles to happen, then we have to explain that in light of the immutability, eternality, and transcendence of God. We need a proportionate explanation within the divine nature itself. By proportionate explanation, I mean an explanation of God's miracle working power that is internally consistent with all of God's other attributes, mainly his immutability. For instance, if a model of God claims that God is eternal and immutable and all that, then it should also explain from whence God's interactivity with his creation comes in. If God lacks the internal and eternal attribute of interactivity and the benevolence necessary for a miracle, then all we have is after God creates, the universe, then he actually gains an attribute, which is interactivity. Now he begins to be interactive with his creation. Now he begins to be benevolent with something, with another. person or entity, right? Now he begins to be something else. This isn't just a Cambridge change in properties, right? This is a real change in God's essential nature, his benevolence and his interactivity. So let's see which of these models of God allow God to be eternally interactive and benevolent without modifying his immutability. Which of these explains it? Well, let me just clarify real quick. The theological principles of a miracle that God, his nature, must account for is the principle of transcendence, because a miracle is, after all, an act wherein God transcends the natural order that we often observe. Again, quoting St. Thomas Aquinas there. The principle of interactivity, in which a miracle is an act of God wherein he interacts with another person or thing to bring about or express his purpose or his benevolence. And thirdly, the principle of benevolence or love. A miracle is an act wherein God shows his love or his benevolence towards another. So, a miracle could be defined or broken down into three metaphysical theological principles: interactivity, transcendence, and benevolence. It is an interactive, transcendent act of benevolence. So, all three religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, agree that God is transcendent and immutable. All three do. Pretty consistent, which is nice. We can all agree on number one. Number two and three, that's where things get confusing. Let's see which of these models of God allow God to be eternally interactive before creation, right? Otherwise, if he becomes interactive, essentially interactive after creation, that means there's an essential change to God and therefore he's not immutable, right? Which of these models of God between the three religions can show that God himself is principally interactive and also essentially benevolent? Number one, on the principle of interactivity, is God eternally, unchangeably interactive? Well, I'll say it another way. Does God begin to be the kind of transcendent being who interacts with another? If you say, yes, God is a monad, he's by himself before creation, there's no other persons in God, he's just a monad, then that means that God is not essentially interactive. And so if you say, but he becomes interactive when he makes the universe, then you're saying that there's an actual change in God, which means he's no longer essentially immutable. So modern Judaism and Islam must say, yes, he begins to become interactive. But Christianity does not say that God begins to be the kind of transcendent being who interacts. We would say, no, God doesn't begin to be that kind of being. God simply always has been that kind of interactive being, in that he has always been interactive with another because of the internal relations of the Trinity. So, thus, he remains immutable while always being interactive. And again, we need an essentially interactive God to explain those principles that are necessary for a miracle to be possible. And then we go to the principle of benevolence. Again, we have to ask, is God eternally, unchangeably loving / benevolent? Well, yeah, we'll say it again. Does God begin to, right? I'm really trying to get at the immutability here. Does God begin to be the kind of transcendent being who loves, who's benevolent towards another? Well, if he's a monad, if he's alone, there's no other persons present, no other relations subsistent within the divine nature, within God. If there's no other, he's just a monad like in modern Judaism and Islam. If they say yes, he begins to be interactive, he begins to be benevolent after he makes something to love, right? The universe and people. If he begins to be that way, he is no longer essentially immutable. Again, he changes in a real way. But again, they have to say yes. Otherwise, they can't say that he does miracles, because you need some sort of interactive benevolence for miracles. The Christian, though, can say, no, God didn't begin to be loving. God simply has always actually and immutably been loving another person or persons. Because Christianity can say no again, since God is always loving, 1 John 4:8 and 1 John 4:16, God is love. Then we can say that God has eternally had this principle of benevolence that we would need in order for miracles to be explained, and even possible and logically consistent with the divine nature. So, my closing argument is this. We'll start with the evidential part. If at least one non-demonic supernatural miracle exists, I'll focus on the non-demonic here, then an immutably interactive, benevolent, and transcendent God exists. Premise two, at least one non-demonic supernatural miracle does exist. That's the Barbara Kamuski-Snyder miracle that we talked about before for our evidential portion. Since at least one does exist, that means that an immutably interactive, benevolent, and transcendent God exists. Now, here's the issue. Which God, or here's the kicker, which God actually is immutably interactive, benevolent, and transcendent? Well, that would be the God of Christianity. Therefore, the God that exists is the God of Christianity because of the fact that God is immutably interactive, immutably benevolent, and immutably transcendent. So, with that being said, that is my presentation on miracles, evidentially, which one, how we can get rid of all those worldviews that reject miracles, and also of the miracles that accept or could have some sort of explanatory power about miracles, which one makes the most sense. Christianity, by far, through the very nature of God as a trinity with internal relations and internal principles of relations. I think there's more than just these internal principles of relations, but within these relations, these types of principles of interactivity, these principles of benevolence. And if that's the case, then we have a very clear explanation for where miracles come from and which model of God allows for miracles to be. With that being said, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to work a little bit more on this in the future.